Okay. So hello and welcome everyone to our Irish Studies Würzburg guest lecture today. Just a quick heads up, we might take screenshots, so if you do not want to be in the picture, just turn off your camera. And I'm very happy to introduce our guest lecturer today. It's Maurice Fitzpatrick. And Maurice Fitzpatrick is the traveling visiting professor at the University of Tübingen this winter term. And he himself went to Trinity College Dublin, and he has worked at a number of different universities worldwide. For example, at Keio University in Tokyo and at the University of Notre Dame in the United States. And yet, Maurice Fitzpatrick is not just a scholar, but he's also a documentary filmmaker. And he has made two documentary films, The Boys of St Column and Translations Revisited, which is about Brian Field's play Translations. And he has also made a documentary feature film called In the Name of Peace, John Hume in America, about the Northern Irish Nobel Peace Prize winner, John Hume. And for this film, I looked it up yesterday. He interviewed, and I found that quite impressive, not only the former US Presidents Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter, but also Bono. So that might be interesting. He also published two books, The Boys of St Columb and John Hume in America, From Derry to DC. And today he joins us to talk about another boy of St. Column's, and that is the Northern Irish writer Seamus Deane. We look very much forward to your talk, Maurice, and thank you for being here.
Well, sorry. Okay. Grüße Karlsruhe, that's where I am today. Talking to you tomorrow. I'm up in Wuppertal, and the following day I will be in Tübingen again. So I'm really putting the traveling dimension into this visiting professor of Irish studies. It's great to do it. I only wish it were in person, actually, partly because I'm a Cavan man, and it would have been wonderful to go to Würzburg and to follow in the footsteps of my fellow countyman, Saint Killian. But anyway, some other time. But it's still wonderful to join you virtually. And what I'll talk about this afternoon is the life and the legacy of Seamus Deane. Seamus Deane will be known to your class, I think, as a novelist, and indeed he was, but he was also a poet, a critic, an essayist, an anthologizer, a public intellectual, and all in all, a man who wore quite a number of hats. And for our purposes today, and maybe for the purposes of the Irish studies focus in Würzburg, it's interesting also to think of him as someone who very consciously, in several ways, attempted to frame Irish studies through collections of essays. In his last published book, it's called Small World, and it's probably Small World here. Seamus Deane it was published, unfortunately, posthumously. The man died just a month before it hit the bookshelves. But it's a good example, as are several other books by Seamus Deane, Celtic Revival, Strange Country, History of Irish Literature. He made several attempts to try to come to grips with what Irish studies or Irish literature really is, Irish writing is. And that leads me also to another prop I have here. This is a multi-volume work. I'm just holding up one volume, the Field Day Anthology of Irish Writing, of which he was the general editor. So it was a big focus for Deane in the midst of the trauma of the Northern Irish Troubles to attempt to reimagine the country, its writings, its history. And that'll form, of course, a big part of what I'll be talking about today. Now, to start with, I'll like to go to a poem by Seamus Deane. Let me see now if I can, I should share my screen. I should have shared my screen already. There we go. Okay. Yeah, this is from a short poem called Strange Country by Seamus Deane. I think it's a very good entry to Deane and his work. I'll read it now. It is too simple to say I miss you. If there were a language, that could not say leave and had no word for stay. That would be the tongue for this strange country. The poem, I think, immediately establishes the tone of the work of the writer, and it shows you how he is at once fascinated, drawn towards his country, passionately involved with his country, but also deeply uneasy with the language in which he's articulating. The language is, of course, English. And he's imagining the possibility of a language that could express the conditions of this strange country. So there you have a metaphor to begin with, I think, for much of Seamus Deane's exploration of Ireland. Derry city, where Seamus Deane came from, remained arguably his most abiding commitment. There was a defining sense of home for Derry, for him in Derry. And as President Michael D. Higgins, President of Ireland, noted in his eulogy when Seamus Deane died, quote, "Few cities have a writer more embedded in its people, its history, its challenges, its hopes, and its humor," end quote. And I tend to agree with the president there in all his assertions: the history, the challenges, the hopes, and the humor, despite the particularly egregious challenges that people in the north and particularly the northwest, Derry, faced when they grew up. People, and Seamus Deane was born in 1940, so we're talking here about the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which of course is so beautifully captured in the novel I believe you've read in class, Reading in the Dark. Despite those challenges, he still kept his humor and kept his, I think, ironical or even scornful mode when he wrote. When one considers Derry, let's talk about Derry city for a moment. One considers Derry, there's always, I think, a restless dialectic with the concept of home. No sooner, for example, was the dire housing crisis in the city in the 1960s alleviated than the next crisis emerged, the wilderness of tanks and checkpoints and harassment and violence during the Troubles. So concept of home, as Deane is getting at, I think, in this poem, has always been an ill-fitting outfit. Has always been ill at ease, a hat or a suit that doesn't quite fit. And Derry has experienced prolonged dislocation, particularly, I think, the majority Catholic people who lived in the city since the start of the inception of Northern Ireland, because despite being the majority of the city, they were always politically neutered. They were always politically the minority. So that's become part of what Derry is, and part of, also you see this in the novel, part of the strange sensation of not being fully at home, not being allowed to be at home, that the young boy experiences in this novel. To develop this a little further, when Seamus Deane died, an archivist named Dr. John Bowman unearthed an interview he conducted with Seamus Deane in the early 1980s, and in which Deane recounted the experience of leaving St Column's College, this pretty famous school he went to as a day boy. He went to St Column's College, Catholic boys' school, and he would come home through the Bogside area of Derry, a working class part of Derry. And he recalled in this interview with Bowman in the 80s feeling embarrassed when he was walking through the Bogside wearing his school blazer, and some of the factory girls, as they were known, meaning women who worked in Derry's main industry, the shirt factory industry, they would kind of laugh at this boy. You know, you're coming to us now, coming down from the big fancy school, and immediately I think being laughed at for wearing this college blazer immediately sent a signal to the young Deane that something had shifted, a class shift had occurred in his life. He'd been born into the working class, but this moment crystallized that this blazer in a way signified membership of an upwardly mobile class, which was experiencing, by going to a place like St. Column's College, a sudden jolt the hitherto inescapable pressures of unemployment, all the social pathologies that working class Derry experienced, unemployment, alcoholism, domestic violence. There was suddenly in the post-war years the possibility, with the passing of the 1947 Education Act, for people of working class backgrounds and farming class backgrounds to go to school and then onwards to university. And Deane was among the very first to achieve this through the 1947 Education Act, to achieve educational advancement. But it came at that price, or at that moment of self-consciousness, that suddenly I don't quite belong in the same way as I did to this place. I'm moving out of this place as well as belonging to it. But all Deane, I mean, when I first met Seamus Deane in 2007, I interviewed him for an academic journal. He was at pains to emphasize the importance of that Education Act for his whole life, and indeed for many children in Northern Ireland who benefited from that Education Act. As Seamus Heaney put it, it was a generation that had seen a sign and had been lifted out of, again, I'm quoting, the guardian angel of passivity, the guardian angel of passivity. This experience of growing up in Northern Ireland, being constricted, being disenfranchised and excluded from participation in society, was suddenly changed by the possibility of enlightenment, new opportunities. And I think that's an interesting way to put it on the part of Heaney, poet Seamus Heaney, that there was a guardian angel of passivity almost watching over them, and that was over once people started to get confidence, get educated. Okay, I would like to read a passage from Reading in the Dark, since I believe it's the prescribed text for today. And it's, in my edition, this is the vintage, it's page 28, 29, just a short passage. It's from the episode Pistol. And those who've read the book will remember that the background there is that Deane's father, this is a heavily autobiographical book, so I'll just refer to him as Deane's father, had been gifted a pistol, a gun, by a German Navy man who was passing through Derry, and they built up a kind of a friendship. So as a momentum, the Navy man wanted to give Deane's dad a gun, and Deane's dad took it into the house in the full understanding that this is an incriminating item that should never be discovered, that should be kept in safe hiding and safekeeping. And he instructed his children in this way that, you know, don't mention that there's a gun in the house. So let's see what happens next. Young Deane, Seamus Deane, decides to show the gun to some boys in the street. Not a good move. While we were gathering the gun, hefting it, aiming it, measuring its length against our forearms, I felt eyes watching. Fogey McKeefer, known to be a police informer, was at the end of the lane looking on. He was a young, open-faced man of 20 or so, with a bright smile and wide-spaced, round eyes. He looked the soul of candour. He had seen me bring the gun back into the house. I waited 10 minutes, then brought it out again, wrapped in an old newspaper, and buried it in one of the stone trenches up the field. I was so sure that that was enough that I'd forgotten about it even before I went to sleep. But now, here were the police, and the house was being splintered open. The lino was being ripped off, the floorboards crowbarred up, the wardrobe was lying face down in the middle of the floor, and the slashed wallpaper was hanging down in ribbons. We huddled downstairs and held in the center of the room while the kitchen was searched. One policeman opened a tin of Australian peaches and poured the yellow Skidmore slices and the sugar-logged syrup all over the floor. Another went out to the yard and split open a bag of cement in his rucksack of the shed. He came walking in a white cloud, his boots sticking to the slimy lino and the cement falling from him in white flakes. I was still in the silence. Objects seemed to be floating free of gravity all over the room. Everyone had sweat or tears in their faces. Then my father, Liam is his brother, Liam and I were in police cars, and the morning light was already reaching the rooftops as a polished gleam in the slates that fled as we turned the corner of the street towards the police barracks, no more than a few hundred yards away. Where was the gun? I had had it. I had been seen with it. Where was it? The policemen with huge faces bent down to ask me quietly at first, then more and more loudly. They made my father sit at a table and then lean over it with his arms outspread. Then they beat him on the neck and shoulders with rubber truncheons, short and gorge red in color. He told them, but they didn't believe him. So they beat us too, Liam and me, across the table from him. I remembered the sweat and rage on his face as he looked. When they pushed my chin down on the table for a moment, I was looking up at him. Did he wink at me, or were there tears in his eyes? Then my head bounced so hard on the table with the blows that I bit hard on my tongue. For long after, I would come awake in the small hours of the morning, sweating, asking myself over and over, where is the gun? Where is it? Where is the gun? I would rub the sleep and fear that lay like a cobweb across my face. If a light flickered from the street beyond, the image of the police car would reappear and my hair would feel starched and my hands sweaty. The police smell took the oxygen out of the air and left me sitting there with my chest heaving. Okay, so that's an incident when young boys playing at being men, playing with guns, and in Northern Ireland paid an extreme price for that. You can hear in that last paragraph in particular the trauma of that experience. And Deane, when he was, the novel had huge success. When he was on tour with the novel, he confirmed that was that incident did happen, that was rooted in his own experience. And it's a harrowing experience for the Northern minority in Northern Ireland during those decades, maybe extremely so in the cities, in Derry City, Belfast City. And that was the space I tried to explore a little in my first film and book. Here we have a poster there of the poster of the film and the cover of the book, The Boys of St Columb. I've already alluded to St. Colum's College. It's a dominant feature of the Derry City skyscape. And it had, up to that point, 1947, been the preserve of the Catholic and middle class, the priests, people who were connected to the clergy in some way, and it therefore had a small student population. But with the 47 Education Act, suddenly there was an influx of people who passed this academic test required to gain entry into a secondary school or a grammar school. And the argument of this film and this book is that through their getting an education, a generation later, they had the confidence to form the civil rights movement and to demand political change in their society, this first generation to receive education. As you can see, the publisher put a subtitle in the book there, The Education of a New Ireland, and it's quite apposite, I think. It's quite a legitimate claim. So you had the coming of very new voices, people from very different backgrounds into a school like St. Colum's College. And again, that's pretty apparent, I think, in the reaction from the priests and teachers as we encounter them in this novel. Again, I'm going to read briefly from, if you have the edition, it's the religious knowledge episode of the book, the novel, and I'm reading from the top of page 180. So religious knowledge, a priest is presuming to impart to the students all the wisdom and wonders of the Catholic Church, And in the process, he's humiliating them. He's asking them questions that they couldn't answer. He begins his catechism, more an interrogation than a catechistic inquiry. He said, first question is, how long, as the teacher of religious knowledge, does it take a flea to crawl through a barrel of tar? Okay, but I'm going to skip ahead. The priest has come to Deane and is asking Deane theological questions. Tell me then, who or what was the Holy Ghost before he was a ghost? I was silent. To the left of me, Alec McShane laughed. The teacher frowned. We are dealing here with a theological conundrum of signal importance, hardly the occasion for another display of the idiocy of rural life. I would like an answer. He pointed at me again. I can't say, Father, I don't have an answer. Good. On the first question, you don't understand the answer. On the second, you deny the validity of the question. On the third, you have no answer. I hope now that you can see why religion is different. My chief desire is to let you see that there is that which is rational and that which is irrational, and that which is non-rational, and to leave you weltering in that morass thereafter. I shall thereby do the state some service and the church even more. Doctrine, dogma, and decision, these you can live by so that you may avoid the disintegration of the mind. Not a serious threat, I have to say, for many in this or of this class of person ranked so monotonously before me. This man's father was a papal knight. He was Sir Roy Creedon, Sir. I was enraged, but my rage made me smile. He was right. This was education. Okay, so you have this person humiliating boys, asking them impossible questions and getting great sport when they're not quite sitting comfortably in their chairs. But Deane comes, or the figure who stands for Deane in this novel, comes to an interesting conclusion there. This man has senior church connections. His father was a papal knight, and he goes with this title of Sir. And indeed, it's enraging to encounter that level of snobbery and that level of contempt in the guise of education. However, there is this quiet realization in the young Deane, and indeed I suggest many of that generation, that the Catholic middle class in society and in Derry City is going to have a shuddering awakening in a few years when people like Deane come of age and demand change, not only of the unionist system in Northern Ireland, but also of the cozy arrangement that the Catholic middle class has had since the foundation of Northern Ireland. I can't read too much more, there's not enough time, but just to skip on a little bit, the priest goes on and says, now, thanks to free education and godless socialism, we shall have the simple faith of the proletariat. So he's sort of dismissing them on class grounds and pointing out that their education is as a result of, well, what he's referring to as socialism. Probably in Germany would be more social democracy, the spreading of free education in the post-war years in Britain. It came to Northern Ireland a few years after it came to Britain. But this was a huge departure, and it made a huge change throughout the United Kingdom. But I would suggest as well, it had a huge political significance when this first generation came of age in Derry City. So with that, maybe we could go to the first clip, please, Franca. Thanks. This is from the Boys of St Columb, and just gives you some background what it's like for those boys to enter this school. Right, when I reflect now, a few years later, a decade later, since making the film, working with Deane and Heaney and John Hume and others, Amy McCann, who were part of that film, when I think about how Deane's thought was incorporated in the film, what distinctive role he played in the film. One aspect of his analysis that comes through most prominently, I think, is his drive to extrapolate from the conflict, both the latent conflict in Northern Ireland in the 50s, because there wasn't violence in the 50s and early 60s, but the latent conflict and then the actual conflict that happened later from the 60s on. He tries to extrapolate from the practices within the walls of St. Colum's College, signals of what was wrong with the society, what was inherently violent in that society. And he does give the film, I think, a good degree of ideological drive. And for that, I'm very grateful to him for his participation. He spoke, quite extensively about the cultural hegemony that the priests and the teachers attempted to foist upon the students who went to the St. Colum's College. And indeed, that comes through in the novel as well, in Reading in the Dark. Many years after interviewing the Boys of St. Column's, I came upon a cache of letters written between Seamus Heaney and Seamus Deane. They were schoolmates. They went to in the same school. They were in the same class. They went on from there to Queen's University and remained lifelong friends. But so in their correspondence, I'll just go to my PowerPoint here. I came across this letter. Heaney writes to Deane, "Many times since I saw you in Derry at the preparation for the St. Colum's film I intended to write, but, quote, shying as usual. Nothing shy about your interview in the St. Colum's book, all the same. Terrific scalding reading of the whole northern situation. It made me wish we could relive those field day days and nights, made me envy your passion and intellectual force." Okay, I'll talk about field day later today, but the word scalding, I think, is quite appropriate. I remember feeling that when interviewing him. He was very, very ruthless in his analysis of the unionist system in Northern Ireland, the one into which he was born and acculturated, I suppose. But equally so with the priest class, the Catholic middle class, as I've alluded to already. And he was also at pains to highlight that the overturning of the inter-community domination, if you like, the reproduction of the unionist system, but also the reproduction of the Catholic norms that into which he was born was a big part of the liberation struggle in the 1960s. As he put it, and I think I've got this quote here, "The belief in the church became a form of resentment and yet another tough form of authority. And that intensified as people came to the school. The church unwittingly committed a form of political suicide because it brutally revealed its alliance with all sorts of things which were not officially Christian, not as such, like the class prejudices of the teachers." So we'll turn now to a famous classmate of Seamus Deane's. I've mentioned him already, Seamus Heaney, the poet. And Heaney wrote quite a bit about his childhood, certainly, and also his school days. But he one poem in particular he wrote about, dedicated to Seamus Deane, about their school days. And I think it does bring out something of the novel's context, how it felt to be in St. Colum's College, to be, in Heaney's case, he was a boarder. He was a boarder in St. Colum's, and Deane was a day boy, and just grappling with the experience of getting educated. The first generation to be educated, their parents wouldn't have been educated. So he wrote this poem. It's called "The Ministry of Fear." It's a long poem. I will not be able to read it all, but let's read a little bit of it anyhow. Well, so it's from the singing school and Ministry of Fear. "Well, as Kavanagh said, we have lived in important places. That lonely scarp of St. Colum's College, where I billeted for 6 years, overlooked your bogside. I gazed into new worlds, the inflamed throat of Brandywell, it's it's floodlit dog track, the throttle of the hare. In the first week, I was so homesick I couldn't even eat the biscuits left to sweeten my exile. I threw them over the fence one night in September 1951, when the lights of houses in the Lecky Road were amber in the fog. It was an act of stealth. Sorry, the text is a little bit lost, but you can take it from me. Then Belfast, and then Berkeley. There's two ons are sophisticated, dabbling in verses till they have become a life, from bulky envelopes arriving in vacation time to slim volumes dispatched with authors' compliments. Those poems in longhand ripped from the wire spire of your exercise book bewildered me. Vowels and ideas bandied free as the seed pods blowing off our sycamores. I tried to write about the sycamores and innovated a South Derry rhyme with hushed and lulled full chimes for pushed and pulled. Those hobnail boots from beyond the mountain were walking, by God, all over the fine lawns of elocution. So I think that shows you the full sweep, the transition that people like Seamus Deane, Seamus Heaney made from leaving the farm or leaving the working class area of Derry and going on, getting educated, becoming a voice in society, I suppose it's fair to say, becoming prominent and communicating through essays, through writing poems, working for the BBC, lecturing in university, and eventually helping to form the civil rights movement and writing about the dilemmas felt by the Catholic minority in Northern Ireland. And the best way I can illustrate this is with another clip, but we'll have to drúcadí dáman that this one works. Let's see. This is from halfway through the Boys of St Column. Let's see if this works, Frank. So, as Bishop Edward Daly there summarized so well, people like Bernadette Devlin, Eamon McCann, John Hume suddenly emerge as a result of this Education Act, demanding radical change, demanding an end to I don't need to get into too many details, but the end of the business vote, the way in which housing allocation was completely rigged, the various complaints and aspects of the campaign that the civil rights movement had. And the civil rights movement was both radical and welcome, but also extremely effective. It gained many of its demands within a few months, not all. And for some people, the gains were not enough. They wished to push for more. For others, it was the civil rights movement moment, what I call it, the moment, the late 1968-69 moment, was an opportunity to end the Irish border. The partitioning of the country had happened. It had been a dramatic failure from the point of view of Irish nationalists, particularly Irish nationalists in the north. And this was a chance to push for that form of civil right, the right to self-definition within the island of Ireland. And that, of course, proved to be a fantasy. That was not going to happen. And the Unionist government became quite stringent in its measures against the civil rights movement. And obviously the British government deployed its army on the streets of Northern Ireland to devastating effects. And that really spelt the end of the civil rights movement. The ultimate moment came when there was a civil rights movement march in Derry in January 72, and the British Army opened fire, murdering people in what became known as Bloody Sunday. Again, to bring this back to our subject, Seamus Deane, he wrote a poem in response to that. It's a long poem, I can't read it all, but I'm reading from After Derry, and this is his response to Bloody Sunday, the murdering of 14 innocent civilians in Derry in January 1702, and he wrote this poem after Derry. Let us bury the corpses fast. Death is our future, and now is our past. There are new children in the gaunt houses. Their eyes are fused. Youth has gone out like a light. Only the insects grovel for life. Their strange heads twitching. No one kills them anymore. This is the honeymoon of the cockroach, the small spiderless eternity of the fly. So, if ever there was a poem that expressed the total abject hopelessness, rage, and nihilism of the moment, I think that's it, after Derry. But Deane and others did not give up. They did not cease their, what Blake might call, mental fight to attempt to reimagine Ireland in a more inclusive way, in a modern, pluralistic way. Some will disagree with that statement, certainly, but I will say it anyhow. And that leads me to Deane's role as critic, as well as the role as writer. I showed you already the collection of essays, Small World. And this is a good place to start if you wish to find out more about Seamus Deane as critic. Some of his best essays are collected there. I did have a cavale when I received the book that an early essay called Why Bogside is Omitted, and I regret that because I think it's a very fine essay, but one that also really captures this moment that we've been talking about here, Derry in the 60s, 70s, in which Deane juxtaposes what he called the faded Gaelic love of ease and sociability with the feudal basis of unionism. And that was the cultural and political milieu in which he and others found themselves trying to change, modify, get people to re-examine. And that really is, I think, the nucleus of Seamus Deane's impulse to write critical work on Ireland. He, again and again, you find it in this book as well, you find essays that are both rooted in the here and now, the trouble of Northern Ireland, but also go right back to the origin of the Troubles. And I'm going to refer now to one in particular in this book. It's called Civilians and Barbarians. He published it as a pamphlet, actually, in 1983. And on its publication, he got into a lot of trouble. Often academics don't really get into trouble for writing their academic work. It just gets ignored. But this was different. By writing essays like that, like Civilians and Barbarians, Deane was positioning himself, I think, as a public intellectual and writing in a very polemical way. And it's most profitably read, I think, in tandem with another pamphlet written by Edmund Spenser, which I'll actually will quote from in a moment. Edmund Spenser wrote a pamphlet, a long pamphlet called A View of the Present State of Ireland, and he wrote that in 1596. So you may wonder how exactly can that pamphlet be in dialogue with Seamus Deane's pamphlet written in 1983? Well, it actually has a lot in common. What Spenser posits in this famous diatribe is that there's a justification for anglicizing every strata of Irish society: Irish law, Irish religion, culture, dress, customs, codes, hairstyles, everything. And the pamphlet takes the form of a dialogue between two Englishmen. One is named Edox, and the other one is Aaron. And Aaron has been to Ireland, and he relates to Edox his observations and experiences. And Edox has never been there, but he's progressively more and more horrified by what he hears about the Irish. And the two of them happily agree that what is required here is cultural annihilation. The rationale for it is that if you can obliterate cultural historical memory, then you can replace it with civilization, namely the colonizers' English civilization, the colonizers' political, cultural space and sphere. So when one approaches this pamphlet, you know, it should come with a health warning, but these are kind of statements that are made in it. I've just picked out a few. Spencer argues here, no laws, no penalties can restrain the native Irish, but that they do, in the violence of that fury, tread down and trample underfoot all both divine and human things, and laws themselves they do specially rage at and rend in pieces. So here we have a vision of a people upon whom, you know, culture and civility cannot prosper. You'll see that the language is archaic, but I think it's still legible enough. It's understandable. So Alex asks further about native Irish law, Brehon law. What is that which you call Brehon law? Is it a word unto us altogether unknown? Aaron replies, it is a certain rule of right, unwritten, but delivered by tradition from one to another. The Brehon that is their judge will compound between the murderer and the friends of the party murdered, which prosecute the action, and the malefactor shall give unto them or the child or wife of him that is slain a recompense, which they call an irshk, by which vile law of theirs many murderers are amongst them made up and smothered. So, you know, there's a complete recoil over this way of treating criminals and murderers, and the Brehon law in itself is regarded almost like we would, you know, many people speak of Sharia law in contemptuous terms, but here we have the British colonizing voice. I mean, it's important to remember that Spencer had an official role as an advisor to the Lord Deputy of Ireland. He wasn't simply a writer or a poet. He was also a part of the colonial machine, and he was writing this pamphlet. So these views do matter from a political point of view as well. And just one last quote from this pamphlet. It had always been the use of the conqueror to dispose the language of the conquered, and to force him by means to learn his. In other words, this is an advocacy of replacing the Irish language with English, and to do so for putatively civilizing ideals or putatively idealizing agenda. And Deane's pamphlet traces civilians and barbarians. He traces the discourse of civilians and barbarians right back to a pamphlet like Spencer's. He talks about other Hazlitt, Coleridge, other English writers who wrote on Ireland, and he sort of shows the discourse for what it is. I mean, it's a discourse that's it's pretending to convey civility on the Irish, but as a matter of fact, it's advocating the most barbaric means to do so. And the political hypocrisy of that comes very clearly through in the pamphlet. And again, one could say, look, academics write work all the time, and it doesn't enter the mainstream of public discussion. But what Deane did was he traced this tenor of debate or tenor of discussion on Ireland from the early modern period right up to the middle of the Troubles. The hunger strikes period had just happened, and he juxtaposes what's happening there with what has happened in the past, and that did stir up a great deal of controversy. There was a strong unionist critique, and Deane, well, he somewhat answered. He didn't have. I don't think he had a great deal of sympathy with it, but it's an interesting approach, and it has been seen by some critics like Anthony Roach, for example, as a key text to attempt to understand Brian Friel's translations. Because when you read that play, this masterpiece by Brian Friel, great work of drama, you see this juxtaposition happening again and again, that English ways, the English language, the English method of mapping the country, the OS mapping of the country, just English rationality comes face to face with the Irish, who are not advanced, not civilized. They need English civilization to bring them along. There is that strain running underneath throughout the play, Brian Friel's translations. And as Deane writes in the general introduction to that book I just held up a while back, Field Day Anthology, versions of Ireland and its history and culture were created by many groups within the island, colonists and colonized, in attempts to ratify an existing political and economic system or to justify its alteration or its extinction. And it's an interesting insertion there to also acknowledge that the colonized do this as well. The colonized play to stereotypes or invent stereotypes, patterns of behavior, responses that that ensure that they remain in this bind, the colonized and the colonist and colonized bind. And I think what one can find in Seamus Deane's work routinely is an attempt to try to think beyond this. A full acknowledgement that it's extremely hard. This historical conditioning is as deep as it goes. But at the same time, in his attempt to envisage an Irish Republic, a genuine Irish Republic, I think he understands the necessity to try to transcend the colonial discourse that binds both the colonist, but maybe more importantly, the colonized. So that was a big project that he had. You find his form of republicanism that permeates his writings. Okay, how are we doing for time? Okay. I wanted to speak for around an hour. I think I'm running over time as usual, but it wouldn't do not to talk a little bit more about Field Day, because, well, Field Day was a theatre company, a publication enterprise, of which Deane was part. He wasn't the founding member, but he did play a major role in it. It grew out of that play I just mentioned a moment ago, Brian Friel's translations, and the journey that translations had towards being produced in Derry is a very interesting story. Derry at this stage was a bombed out city. It didn't have a theatre. It did have a world-renowned playwright in the form of Brian Friel, but there was nowhere to stage a play. And Brian Friel was very determined to write something that would insert his work, his art, into this political crisis. His collaborator, an actor named Stephen Ray, was also keen to do this and to help him. And out of that sort of matrix came Brian Friel's translations. And when the play was ready and they wanted to stage it, they were determined to stage it in Derry. As Friel said at the time, once we've been heard here, we can be overheard elsewhere. It was a very determined positioning of the play that, yeah, it can play in the West End of London, it can play in Broadway in New York, fine, but first it will be played here because it's for the people of here to see their history in a new fashion and see how did we arrive at this moment where we are almost forced or determined to see everything in terms of A and B, in terms of this division. And I think that's one of the great successes of the play, to force people to reevaluate how that discourse emerged. So they needed it. This was like Pirandello. Pirandello had 6 characters in search of an author. This was a playwright and a play in search of a theatre, and they went to the Guildhall, that what you would call the Rat House, and asked the burghers of Derry whether they could stage the play in the Guildhall, and they said yes, you can rig it up and make a theatre out of it. And what Stephen Ray said at the time is, we found a dead political space and we made it a live theatrical space. And they brought people into this civic space, which is where, almost the center of paralysis, to use a Joycean term, the center of the political intransigence, and got them to see this play that said so much, I think, about their identity So, and at the time, I think Deane said it so well in a program note for Field Day. He said, theatre finds its sense of origin in an audience, which it has to invent. Field Day is inventing an audience. It is therefore also inventing an idea of an origin. It finds itself in terms of its audience. It has within it the idea of a culture which has not yet come to be in political terms. The idea of a theatre without a roof over its head is precisely right for now. So just to go through this a little, it has within it the idea of a culture which has not yet come to be in political terms. So Deane, maybe principally, I think, Brian Friel and others, were attempting to establish a cultural state. There was, I think, a consensus within the theatre group and the publication group, Field Day, that the states of Ireland had failed. The South had become dominated by the Catholic Church and conservatism. The North certainly had failed, becoming a plaything of the unionist system, completely manipulated by the unionist ideology. And they had this radical idea to attempt to forge a cultural state where we can't quite get there politically, but let's attempt to forge a cultural state. If one can bring people into a theatre and have a discussion about any difficult issues through staging a play, a reading, or a poetry collection, or whatever it may be, that this could lead to a cultural state, and out of this cultural state could come potentially a political state, a more stable political state in the island of Ireland. That was their vision. It really was a high ideal that they had. It wasn't simply, when I say a theatre company, there are many, of course, but this was a uniquely talented group of people with a major cultural and political agenda, I would say. But you don't have to take my word for it. There's some backup on this. Franca, maybe we'll play the first clip from my film, Translations Revisited. This is looking back at the play more than 30 years after its first staging in Derry. So as you can see there, this amazing reinvigoration of the Guildhall. This world-class artists come together and they put together a play that asks these searching questions about Irish identity. And it did have, ultimately, I'm going to summarize now because we've kind of run out of time. I said I would speak for 60 minutes. It did have, ultimately, the effect of making some alteration in people's awareness of themselves, awareness of their past, and that shared past that they have as well, that we have in Ireland. Deane wrote in a poem, I'll just quote a couple of sentences of it, a poem called Return. The concept is returning to Derry, return. And he said, in this Irish past I dwell, like sound implicit in a bell. In this Irish past I dwell, like sound implicit in a bell. And I think there was an attempt on the part of all of the above mentioned artists and thinkers and critics and historians and playwrights to really search for a cultural significance that would assist a new political reality that came ultimately with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. There were many reasons for the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, the coming of peace finally to Northern Ireland after a generation of destruction and misery and killing. There was, and I don't deny them for a minute, there was fatigue, there was a recognition that this violence was not bringing any political solution whatsoever, rather deepening the political problems. But I also would assert that the work of these writers and these thinkers on the question of Ireland and the complexity of Ireland's heritage did play a role in forging a new form of Irishness that could be a more hospitable form of Irishness that could be more broadly widely embraced. And it did cause a lot of upset. I don't for a minute say that the Field Day project was by any stretch of the imagination perfect. There was a major, for example, feminist reaction that the Field Day anthology hadn't included enough women writers. There was a reaction from the South that this was a very navel-gazing exercise, that, you know, of course, that Northerners had their particular history, but things had happened in the South as well. And some liberal journalists and revisionist historians lambasted Field Day for being too concerned with Northern issues. Some just didn't buy into it, this idea that there's Ireland is made up of 4 provinces, but Field Day styled itself as occupying a 5th province. And that some people didn't quite see that was a legitimate claim. But it did something that great art can do. It generated public debate and forced a lot of the public to think anew about themselves and their inheritance. And that was a big part of Deane's legacy, I think. So with that, I think it's time to open up for some questions and comments. You're very welcome.
Yes, thank you so much, Maurice, for this very, very interesting talk on Northern Ireland, on Seamus Deane, and also on Brian Friel's translations. Yes. Do we have a question? Does anyone would like to ask something? Okay. Otherwise, I can start with a question, because you mentioned there was a feminist reaction to Seamus Deane's publication, and I was also wondering, because you mentioned the Education Act, etc., and all these boys suddenly going to school. Was the situation the same for girls? Were they then also able to go to school, or was that very different?
Oh yeah. The Education Act, the 1947 Education Act, it lifted all boats. It helped girls and boys and Catholics and Protestants equally. I was just reading recently a historian, social commentator named Henry Patterson, who writes on Northern Ireland from resolutely class-based. He's got a resolutely class-based analysis, and he often refers to the 47 Education Act. Actually, he's from a Protestant background himself. However, I mean, for one thing, I concentrated on one school, which happened to be a boys' school. I wasn't implying that there weren't other stories to be told, but rather that this was a really good example of how transformative that education legislation had been. And the people who emerged, like John Hume won a Nobel Prize, Seamus Heaney won a Nobel Prize, Seamus Deane, well, we've talked about him for an hour now, major leader in Irish literature and criticism and Irish studies in the United States and elsewhere. They were remarkable people. Brian Friel, playwright, went there as well, went to St Column's College. So I think as a filmmaker, you have to start with a story, a really good story, a story that will have broad appeal and that has strong characters to convey the story. So it's not, I mean, if I were writing a thesis about the effects of the 47 Education Act, I certainly wouldn't just concentrate on one school. And these boys, the boys of St Columb, they had sisters, and the sisters went to school as well. Those who passed the 11 plus, the academic test required to get into grammar school. So the more academically inclined kids went on to grammar school. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, Jule, please speak up.
So when reading in the Dark, I had the impression that those priests that were also teachers educated their pupils rather reluctantly. I was wondering if that's an impression that not only I have, and why you think that might be the case.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah. Well, I think you're quite right. Broadly, that's absolutely a fair statement. Again, I wouldn't probably want to generalize too much. There were good teachers in St. Column's College. I remember, well, I won't dig for it now, but you know, Father McGlinchey, who's taught classics, to name a name, or Sean B. O'Kelly, who taught English, really inspired these boys. Taught them the classics and taught them how to, think about them. Maybe they didn't push as far as they might have. Maybe the clerical strictures of their own formation pulled them back a little. Even those who weren't priests, like Sean B. O'Kelly was a lay teacher, but still, there were good teachers there. All in all, however, I would say the jury would conclude that the broad sweep of teachers in St. Column's College were extremely violent, and there was a great deal of snobbery, a great deal of victimization, bullying on the part of the teacher, even fomenting violence between boys, like the sort of thing you just would not consider the antithesis of education. They indulged themselves in these idiotic practices, and it scarred the boys. It scarred Seamus Deane for certain. That little aperçu he had regarding the priest who was attempting to humiliate him, and he said, yeah, this was education. He did, it's like the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, the slave does learn something about the so-called master. You see the weakness and the lack of integrity on the part of the so-called leader, and the young boy, being 13, 14 years old, whatever, is seeing this, maybe not articulating a critique as yet, but is remembering what he's seeing, and is able later in life, he's able in a very articulate fashion, formidably intellectual fashion, to put forward that critique. So yeah, why do they behave that way? Well, one reason is frustration. I mean, Eamon McCann, in a clip, in a part of the film that we did not see, Eamon McCann, in a rather charitable way, says, these priests who were pushed into becoming priests, been educated in an all-male environment, then an all-male seminary, then pushed back into a school which was all-male. I mean, some of them just were miserable with this life and took out the frustration on the boys. Of course, I don't justify it, but that's it's one view. And another is that I did talk a little bit about this, the class, the exclusive hold that the Catholic middle class had on education, on jobs, on money in the city, and that this was very unsettled by the arrival of people whose parents were not wealthy, were not people of means, financial means, and that caused an immediate distaste. I remember speaking to somebody about this. I was told I was going up to Derry, make a film about the Boys of St Columb, and he immediately said to me, yeah, that would have been a snob school, and the teachers and priests would have treated those boys coming in with total contempt. He was absolutely right. And the man who said that to me come from a different part of Ireland. So it wasn't unique to Derry, this contempt expressed, but of course it was completely futile. These boys were going on, and they were growing in confidence, and much as we may decry, and we should decry, the educational practices or practices done in the name of education, nevertheless, they managed, not maybe every one of them, but most of them managed to get through, and it was a dramatic departure from what their forebears, the previous generations, had known. I mean, I remember speaking to somebody. I did a lot of interviewing for the book, running around Derry just for this book here, talking to brothers, cousins, anyone I could talk to who had some relationship with the school. And I asked them, in my naivety, I asked them, could you have gone to St Column's College without the 1947 Education Act? And he said to me, I wouldn't have had a hope in hell. It was as simple as that. No way into school without this opening up of the sluice gates. That was, you know, a result of, actually, believe it or not, a Tory, a Conservative Party thinker named, I'll think of the name, had written this report in 1944 advocating investment in education. It had happened in France already, Jules Ferry in France, and Bismarck, all right, back to Bismarck's time in Germany. But so Britain was catching up. And once the legislation was passed in Britain under the Attlee government, the post-war Clement Attlee government, then it had to be passed in Northern Ireland because of the unionist system. We're all part of the United Kingdom. But it, more than almost anything else I can think of, it changed the face of Northern Ireland. It's a slow burn. It does take time. But once those kids got educated, and they really did change things in the 60s. Butler, the Butler Education Act, or Butler Education Minute on Education, something like that. He devised the rationale behind opening up education to the working class in Britain, 1944.
Okay, thank you. It's a lot of information.
Sorry, I went on forever there. You know?
No, it was interesting. Thank you.
Anyone else have a question for Maurice? On the matter of teachers, I just found it really interesting because I think Seamus Deane and also John Hume, whom you did your other documentary film, they also, I think they both decided to later on become teachers.
Yeah, that's right. Deane was a school teacher for a while, then he became a university lecturer in his late 20s and remained, you know, he remained in universities from then on. Hume was briefly a teacher too. He taught French and history, and I think ambition, ambition, but in the best sense of the word, ambition to do something for the wider community, social change. You know, Hume was regarded as what they call in Derry, a coming man, as somebody who's coming, and he's got a lot of potential. And but while in school, he was also doing that. He became president of the Irish League of Credit Unions, which was an all-island body all across Ireland. So in the middle of the night, he would be going up and down throughout Ireland, opening up credit unions and combining this with a teaching career. So ultimately, it just became unsustainable. And ultimately, I think he felt that to make political change, he had to become formally involved in politics. But let's remember as well, for someone like Hume or someone like Deane or Heaney, to be a teacher was a huge social advance. A secure job as a teacher was not really thinkable for their parents. But they had a great deal of talent, and Heaney, even by his late 20s, he had although he'd done some teaching, he risked it to become a full-time poet.
Thank you. Any other questions? I think something, maybe someone would like to ask a question on that, something we discussed a lot in class, because we read Reading in the Dark in the class on the Irish Gothic, actually. And we discussed a lot about, is this text a Gothic text or not so much, because it also has elements of other genres. And yeah.
Oh, yeah, I definitely think so, yes. I didn't dwell so much. I mean, there's so many ways one can approach this novel. I think it's one of the more seminal novels on Northern Irish Troubles. So there are episodes in which yeah, one can see the Gothic dimensions of it, and ghost stories, for sure. It links with, I think, other Irish Gothic novels like Dracula, and I came across a paper which I could send to you if you wish, that tries to link a number of different Irish Gothic novels with this novel. But absolutely, yeah, I think it could be seen also as a novel that tries to shows very clearly the effects of partition. There are episodes up in Donegal, the beauty of Donegal, the wonderful landscape, but the freedom that one can see, feel and breathe up in Donegal, and then the return across the humpback bridge to Derry, and to checks and to surveillance, suspicion, basically, the depiction of a police state. One could also read it, I suppose, as a Bildungsroman, what you call a Künstlerroman. This young man is coming, he's becoming a writer, he's becoming a thinker, and
yeah, I think these were also the genres we discussed. So Bildungsroman, and then the Gothic,
yeah.
and then I think we also discussed the genre of the detective story, because in some way it also has these detective elements, like finding out about the family secret, etc. And this boy kind of engaging in finding clues about what actually happened, etc. And then in the end, finding it out, and yeah, it's not really resolution, but at least he knows.
No, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's told episodically, and what I gather, Seamus Deane was quite reluctant to write it, and his publisher kept encouraging him. He'd heard, this is how the story goes, but there was some function for Seamus Heaney when he won the Nobel Prize in New York City, and Deane was over for it, and Deane was regaling people with stories of Derry, childhood, and all that. And his publisher said, you need to write a book on that. There's a book in there somewhere. Come on, you can do it. And he kept pushing him and pulling it out of him. So I think, I can't prove this, but my suspicion is that he wrote it, he could write it in episodes. Some of the earliest forms of Reading in the Dark were published long before the novel. So he was toying, I think, with writing a more extensive fiction, but this was the push that got him going.
Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, I keep asking questions. That's not a problem. I was wondering, maybe that's a bit of a topic change, but what did you think of the recent Northern Irish movie that was quite successful? What do you think about Belfast?
Belfast, yeah, I saw it. I saw it in Karlsruhe, actually, and I wrote something on it. I wrote an article. All in all, I disapprove of it. I think it's full of nostalgia. What is it James Joyce said about sentiment? Sentiment is unearned emotion. I think there's a lot of unearned emotion in that film. Some beautiful acting, and I like the monochrome effects, but no, all in all, I think it was so widely welcomed across the world, but still, I don't think it grappled with some of the important issues that it could have or should have. Remember that scene with the mother, who's maybe the best actress in the whole thing? She turns off the television of the sign of trouble, and I think there's a political, major political events happening in that film, and it sort of comes up close and then pulls away from. I found that tremendously irritating. And sure, it's a free world. You can make any film you like, or any work of art you wish. But it's not to my taste. What he did there, Kenneth Branagh, I think he could have done a far more meaningful job if he'd taken a different approach. Hunger is my favorite film about the Northern Irish Troubles. And that's a film that faces the issue in a big way. And
Probably not a feel-good movie like that.
I remember showing it to students just before Christmas. I've got the perfect Christmas film for you. No, it's not, but it's tremendous work of art and performances. Michael Fassbender, Liam Cunningham, the priest. There really are some great performances in there. And there are many good films about the North.
Okay. Did anyone think of a question in the meantime?
Okay, well, I think we're going up to
Yeah,
time
otherwise
now.
yeah, we can also wrap it up here. Okay, then thank you so much again for being here. Thank you for your talk. Thank you for your patience in answering our questions. Yes, let's give you a round of applause and yeah.
Thanks. See you sometime. Take good care. And it was my pleasure to participate. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.